Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Radim Jacques, and I am the Regional Coordinator for Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the International Center for Migration Policy Development. It is the 18th of June, 2020, shortly after 10:30, and on behalf of the Prague Process Secretariat, I have the pleasure to welcome you to the fourth Prague Process webinar. The first webinar, with the title, The Possible Impact of COVID-19 on the EU's Demand for High-Skilled Migrants with Mr. Glenn Hodgson, took place on the 16th of April. The second webinar, The Impact of Corona Crisis on Migration with Professor Rainer Münz, took place on 15th of May. The third webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on Ukrainian labor migrants in the EU, with Mr. Ruslan Minic and Mr. Pavlo Kravchuk, took place on 28th of May. The title of the webinar today is The Evolution of the European Union's External Migration Policy and the Impacts of the Pandemic by Mr. Krzysztof Tamás. The topic has direct connection to the Prague process being one of the instruments of the EU external policy, and is of great interest also in the context of the ongoing debate about the EU multi-annual financial framework and the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum set for start this summer. Each of the webinars, also this one, is accompanied by a publication of a related policy brief, which is available in English and Russian and distributed via email and the Prague Process website. This is also the case today. The policy brief was published in November 2019, so today's presentation goes beyond what is written in the document. The author and today's presenter, Mr. Krzysztof Tamás, is the director of the Migration Studies Delegation based in Stockholm. Previously, he has been a senior policy advisor at the Secretariat for the Swedish chairmanship of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, seconded national expert in the European Commission, deputy director at the Swedish Ministries for Foreign Affairs and Justice, and worked as an independent research consultant for inter alia the European Commission, IOM, and the World Bank. Before we start, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Prague Process team for organizing this webinar. Mr. Alexander Maleyev, the project manager, Ms. Irina Lusak, project officer, and Ms. Julia Zubotska, project assistant. After the presentation, we will continue with a questions and answers session that will be facilitated by Irina Lusak. Please feel free to raise your questions already during the presentation in writing, in English or Russian, using the chat function of Zoom. Last but not least, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online after editing. Enjoy the webinar, and I hand over to Krzysztof Tamás. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Radim. Good morning to you all. I'm happy to be here and participate, and thank you all for attending. As you heard, my talk today will be about the topic of the evolution of the EU's external migration policy and the impacts of the pandemic. The recent pandemic is an addition because we are living through very difficult times. But the first part of my presentation is, as you heard, based on a policy brief that has been published online. I did that policy brief as a private research consultant while I was on leave from Delmi. So what I say now doesn't necessarily represent the views of Delmi. Let me start by saying that I will first talk about the EU external cooperation on migration. This has revolved around the global approach to migration, the framework in place for the European Union external relations in migration. This was introduced in 2005 and extended with an additional focus also on mobility in 2011. Later, the Migration Partnership Framework under the European Agenda on Migration was put in place in 2016. And what has been referred to as migration dialogues have been used as a key channel in finding common ground with third countries in the area of migration and asylum. The EU has expected to establish effectiveness, shared responsibilities, and mutual interests in the implementation of EU external cooperation. As these objectives have not been fully met, the EU should now probably explore how partner countries' interests can be better accommodated within this cooperation framework. So my main question for today's talk about external migration policy is, how have the EU migration dialogues evolved, and what have been their importance and effectiveness in external migration cooperation? Starting then with the global approach to migration, this was motivated by a migration crisis at the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla in Morocco in September 2005, when hundreds of African migrants stormed the barbed wire fences that constituted EU external borders. It also emerged as a response to the difficulties to put effective pressure on third countries regarding readmission and returns through a purely security-oriented approach. So it was seen as necessary to put migration within a broader context, also including migration and development and opportunities for legal migration, which is of interest to many partner countries to the EU. The relationships between the EU and third countries, which developed within this GAM framework, have been characterized by what we can call asymmetrical interdependence, where the EU side is the more powerful. Nevertheless, the EU cannot force partner countries to act fully as it wishes, for example, in terms of readmission or third country citizens. Neither can it offer all that partner countries might wish for in exchange of cooperation. The EU is, in this sense, restrained as an actor and needs to think creatively in its relations with third country partners. An additional difficulty for the EU to appear as one actor is that the EU member states have held on to competence in regard of admissions and legal migration opportunities, which also reduces the credibility and leverage of the EU actors, for example, the Council, the External Action Service, or the Commission, in the process of negotiations and talks. In most cases, the offer from the EU side has been financial contributions for cooperation, rather than opportunities for labor migration and mobility, which has been the main interest from the partner country side. So moving on to the Migration Partnership Framework, this was also the result of a crisis, the well-known 2015 refugee crisis. The Juncker Commission had already raised the importance of migration with its agenda for migration, which came in the spring, in May 2015. The crisis took full force from the summer and the autumn. And the year after, during about 1 or 2 years, there was a change from the more pragmatic approach of the global approach to migration to more foreign policy at a high level. So high-level EU leaders such as Merkel, Macron, Juncker, and Tusk went to partner countries to put more pressure on them, raising the stakes by both demanding more and offering more to the partners. So now we are all waiting with excitement on the new Commission's migration policy framework, which has been announced to be called a new Migration Pact. The new European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has outlined a general vision for reforming the EU's approach to migration and asylum. She pledged to deliver a new pact which would break the deadlock between member states on long-awaited reforms, striking a more equitable balance between solidarity and responsibility. At the top of her list of priorities was strengthening the EU's external borders and reforming the Dublin regulation. The vision also called for increased solidarity and burden sharing with the states where most asylum seekers and migrants first arrive. This should be combined with A, stronger partnerships with third countries, B, more pathways for legal migration and refugee resettlement, C, a sustainable approach to search and rescue in the Mediterranean to save lives, and D, clear rules for returning people who do not qualify for asylum to their home countries. And a strong majority of member states seem to support using all possible means, conditionality of various types, for example, with visas, development aid and trade, etc., to secure cooperation with third countries. And the new Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, who is a Swedish citizen, is expected to present the pact before the end of June, anytime soon. But we know that there are current difficulties to find compromises. So some experts expect that the new pact will be a watered down compromise in terms of responsibility sharing. But what Ylva Johansson has declared already after having talked to the member states is that much more attention will be placed on effective returns. So return policy will be a key issue in the future. So what are the themes generally for the EU in its external migration dialogues? Well, the themes that you see in the slide is a combination of self-interest on part of the EU and efforts to build trust and serve as a basis for effective cooperation on controlling migration to the EU. The themes have covered the fight against irregular migration, integrated border management, readmissions and visa policies, trafficking and smuggling in human beings, asylum policies and migrant rights, labor migration and integration, as well as the links between migration and development. After a couple of years of work, let's say 20 years of progress, there has been a lot of evolution in terms of cooperation, for example, with visa liberalization linked to readmission agreements, implementation of the integrated border management concept, closer engagement of Frontex in external cooperation, improved document security through biometrics, and overall improved data exchange. But still, some partner countries would like to see more emphasis on their own specific interests and needs, such as access to more legal migration opportunities or the links between migration and development. So now I would like to briefly go through a couple of the key migration dialogue processes that might be of interest to you, starting with the Budapest process, which has been going on since 1991. And this was the time when East-West migration was on the agenda, top of the agenda, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Since then, there have been 6 ministerial meetings and numerous meetings at the senior officials level, as well as technical experts meetings. For a long time, activities within this dialogue process focused on irregular migration, visa policies and asylum in Eastern and Central European transit countries. But the Budapest process also helped candidate countries for EU membership to prepare and also to build up their capacity for migration management. There was quite an important change in the leadership of the Budapest process, following the 2013 ministerial meeting, with the chairmanship leaving the hands of Hungary, being taken over by Turkey, and the process of the Istanbul Declaration and the Silk Routes Partnership moved the geographical interest of this process more to the east. So the next process is the Prague process since 2009. And you know much more about this than I do, so I will be quite brief. But this has existed since 2009, following a ministerial declaration and a high-level meeting, a joint declaration. And the covered countries include Eastern Partnership countries, the Western Balkans, Central Asia, Turkey, and Russia. The 6 priority themes of the Prague process, they are very similar to the global approach to migration and mobility priorities. And the recent initiative, actually, what we are experiencing today with this webinar, is part of the actual initiatives to create a migration observatory for evidence-based analysis. There is also a training academy to support human resources development in migration management. The European Neighbourhood policy was established in 2014, and this covers 16 southern and eastern neighbor countries to the EU. This is actually a much broader framework than migration and asylum. It covers stabilization, security, and prosperity issues like democracy, rule of law, etc. The ENP also includes EU external migration, which is part of the EU so-called Justice and Home Affairs policy area. In this process with the neighboring countries, the EU has been offering visa liberalization and mobility partnerships. There is a growing interest over the years, of course, that the EU needs migrants, various types of migrants, because of the aging population in the European countries, and that there might be complementarities between the neighboring countries' labor markets to the south and east and the EU labor markets. The overall approach to partnerships have been based on shared responsibility, as well as differentiation, flexibility, and joint ownership. I just want to highlight that after the Arab Spring, dialogues which were called Migration, Mobility and Security were launched in 2011 with Morocco and Tunisia. The idea was the more for more principle. So the more partner countries cooperate with the EU, the more access would they have to various positive outcomes, such as labor, migration, mobility. This cooperation has been based on a country-by-country assessment. So on the next slide, I have migration dialogues to the south. I will not talk very much about this because I think that you might be more interested in the dialogues to the east. But it's worthwhile mentioning that here we have intercontinental dialogues. For example, all of Africa through the African Union and the European Union. There is a strategic partnership since 2000, which is also covering migration. The African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, I think they are about 80 countries across the world. This is also a cooperation since 2000. And currently, actually, the so-called Cotonou Agreement is being renegotiated. So there will be a new ACP agreement, and migration is one of the key issues in the ongoing negotiations this year. I also want to mention that within the Africa-EU cooperation, there is a so-called Africa-EU partnership on migration, mobility, and employment. And there has also been emphasis on managing remittances, the money sent back from migrants to the home countries. There is an African Institute on remittances where the World Bank has been helpful. And then we have the interregional processes. The Rabat process is the biggest one. The Khartoum process is more recent and more focused on a narrow scope of issues, such as irregular migration. So I now want to turn to mobility partnerships, which are quite interesting because they include a group of member states. They are not legally binding. The mobility partnerships have the status of political declarations. So on the one side, you might have, for example, between 10 and 15 EU member states who join on a voluntary basis. On the other side, you have the partner countries listed here. Cape Verde and Moldova were the first two countries. Then we moved on to Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan to the east, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan to the south, and then Belarus in 2016. Also here, we can say it's a kind of a dialogue, but it's a little bit uneven because on the one side you have many EU member states, on the other side you might have quite a small country, and it's very much project-based. Offers come from the participant EU member states, but also the EU, as well as the partner countries. And there is an inbuilt conditionality. The original idea of the mobility partnerships were based on a communication in 2007, which also came with another communication on circular migration. So the idea was also, if the partner countries cooperate, they could be offered circular migration, which is a kind of temporary migration opportunities. The ICMPD is also facilitating this cooperation through a mobility partnership facility. So let me now turn to funding instruments, which are important, and will also show you how cooperation has increased and intensified over the decades. In 2000 and also in the 90s, we had some cooperation. The thematic program on migration and asylum was the first funding instrument for 7 years between 2007 and 2013. There was an amount of 384 million euros available. Some of it, almost a third, went to cooperation projects on irregular migration. 24%, a fourth, went to cooperation on migration and development, but only 14% on labor migration. So you can see how the funding has been distributed. Of course, it's very difficult to compare what various projects cost and the efficiency of various projects, but this is to give you an idea. The EU Emergency Trust Fund was created in 2015 with a focus on EU-Africa cooperation after a summit in Malta, Valletta, between the African Union and the EU. And this was very much focusing on the 2015 refugee crisis. So there was an emergency trust fund set up. The starting capital for this fund was 1.8 billion euros, so much more than previously. And this was also growing with a couple of more billion later. And the idea here was the concept of root causes. So to have various projects that benefit potential and actual migrants along the routes of migration through Africa. So the idea, creating a development which could be an alternative to migrating irregularly to Europe, risking your life in the Mediterranean. Then in 2017, there was a very big step forward in terms of the amount offered in regard of migration. The EU External Investment Plan was launched. And just to give you an idea that here, this was linked to the European Consensus on Development. So a very much strong emphasis on migration and development. And also attracting funds from private investors in Africa, especially. So the starting budget from the Commission was 4 billion euros. And the plan is that member states and private investors will add, so the total amount will be 44 billion, which is a sizable amount for root causes on irregular migration, but also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and development cooperation. So I don't have a slide here, but now I will summarize what I told you so far. So the new Migration Pact is suggesting increased conditionality to accelerate returns of irregular migrants and failed asylum seekers. My assessment of the potential for this is that this can only partly promote trust and share commitments with third countries. Some of the third countries have long been frustrated with the EU's approach to cooperation and the EU presenting its agenda. So the partner countries would like to share the agenda and also to put issues there, for example, remittances, diaspora cooperation, and opportunities for legal migration. The other thing is that now when the EU puts so much money on the link between migration and development, the risk is that this funding will reduce effectiveness of the policies behind migration management, such as development aid or resettlement. So what I see forward is that we need a much broader, both political and economic cooperation framework. So both covering economic and social development, trade relations, labor market policies, social security and education, peace and human security, and even security and good governance might be of interest of partner countries. So the EU needs to be ready to negotiate, bargain, and adapt its previously held stance in terms of these dialogues that I have been talking about. So thank you for listening so far. Now I will move ahead to more current issues, the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. I was asked by ICMPD to give you an assessment. What do we know so far, and what are the effects in terms of migration and integration? It's too early from a research perspective to look at the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic for migration and integration. But in the short term, we already have seen many signs that there are close links between the pandemic and migration, closing borders to contain the contagion and integration. The COVID-19 put a stop to many forms of human mobility. Basically, all countries around the world imposed restrictions on incoming migrants, business people and visitors alike, many also preventing nationals and long-term residents from returning. Most flights were grounded. The whole migration system, from visa processing to refugee resettlement and returns, was put on hold in most countries. Meanwhile, governments used migration management tools, such as border closures, travel restrictions, and bars on asylum to keep COVID-19 from entering their countries, and later also to restrict mobility in order to contain the spread. It was quite soon clear that migrants were among the most vulnerable in relation to the pandemic. Travel bans, closed borders, and living conditions in camps all amplified the risks to migrants. Migrants living in camps or poorer neighborhoods, for example, in and around Europe, risked infection due to their proximity to highly affected countries and their often cramped living conditions in combination with already limited healthcare services. Social distancing was very difficult to practice. In fact, IOM and UNHCR temporarily suspended refugee resettlement due to the mobility restrictions imposed by governments. As governments are now opening up, we need to await data and research to explore the possible long-term and more structural effects on migration and integration from the pandemic. Moving on, a few words about migrants being more likely to be infected by COVID-19. As I mentioned, the pandemic aggravated the existing vulnerabilities of refugees and migrants. Social distancing was very difficult to keep to. Many migrants did not have sufficient information about the coronavirus, especially those who arrived recently and who did not have access to information in their own language. But governments soon tried to ensure that everyone has necessary information about health guidelines and COVID-19 related measures. Health and personal care workers, including many migrants, have been on the front lines of the pandemic. In some countries, many doctors, nurses, and caretakers are immigrants or with migrant background. They have thus been directly exposed to patients and clients infected by COVID-19. Of the 10 million economically active EU free movers in 2018, about 1 million worked in the health and social care sector. In Germany, for example, up to 300,000 Eastern Europeans have been working in the home care sector. Data from various municipalities and regions of Stockholm in Sweden indicate that mortality rates among those infected with COVID-19 are similar across the greater city area. So there is no difference if you are native born or foreign born in the mortality rates, but there is quite a significant difference in the number and the share of individuals who are infected. For example, mortality per 10,000 inhabitants is much higher, around 12% in Rinkeby-Kista and 9% in Tensta, which are inhabited mainly by immigrants, compared to 4% on average in the greater Stockholm city area. And those nationalities who were hardest hit, the most infected, have been people with origin in Somalia, Iraq, Eritrea, Syria, and Iran. Migrants are also more likely to lose their jobs. Unemployment has especially increased in the hospitality business, hotels, travel services, and restaurants, also factory work, where the share of foreign workers, people with a foreign background, has been particularly high, including among self-employed. Also, immigrants have often the weakest links to the labor market with temporary and part-time employment, the first to lose their jobs during times of crisis. Already before the crisis, foreign-born were much less employed than natives, and this situation is now getting worse. But also the less vulnerable workers, those who had jobs, mid-level or lower income jobs, have been losing work and income. Now I would like to mention one particular impact which is hitting the seasonal worker programs, the seasonal foreign workers in agriculture. Because of the lockdown and temporary border closures, many of the agriculture businesses in France, Germany, Italy, Sweden have said that there is a risk that they won't get the workers, and there is a risk that the crops will go unharvested. overall, the shortfall might be about 1 million seasonal agriculture workers across Europe. In Spain, for example, there has been a 40% drop in agricultural workforce, mainly from Morocco and Tunisia. Italy was also very hardly hit because of its large agriculture sector and dependence on 370,000 workers from around the world. So what did governments do? There were various countermeasures. For example, some governments have extended visas, work and residence permits for seasonal workers already present in the country. In addition, some governments have eased industry regulations that limit the amounts of days seasonal workers are allowed to work in order to increase the availability of labor for agricultural producers. As of late March, more than 200,000 Romanian workers, currently the largest group of EU 27 free movers, had returned to Romania from EU countries most hit by the pandemic. And the reasons are complex, might include precarious employment conditions, loss of income, limited health insurance and social security coverage, and also the fear of getting COVID-19 in other European countries. I also would like to put your attention to the remittance flows, which are hit very substantially by COVID-19 and the coronavirus and the lockdowns. According to the World Bank, global remittances are projected to decline sharply by about 20% in 2020 due to the economic crisis induced by the COVID-19 pandemic and shutdowns. And the projected fall, which would be the sharpest decline in recent history, is largely due to a fall in the wages and employment of migrant workers, who tend to be more vulnerable to loss of employment and wages during an economic crisis in a host country. Remittances to low and middle income countries are projected to fall from 445 billion, and actually Europe is one of the most significant in terms of the drop, even higher, 27%. But the good news is that the World Bank is projecting 2021 a rebound, a recovery and rise by 5.6% to 470 billion of these remittance flows. I can see now that I'm running out of time, so I will only briefly touch upon the remaining issues that you see on the slides, that migrants are less likely to integrate because they are losing their jobs and have a lack of work experience, networks, and the skills to get back into employment quickly. So we can foresee more difficulties to integrate on the longer term in the couple of upcoming years. I already mentioned that many migrants had limited access to health services, especially the vulnerable categories, and also the irregular migrant workers who live without health service, and they have been hesitant to seek out help in hospitals because they were afraid to be sent back home. We can also see some examples of possible increase of negative attitudes towards migrants in countries like Italy, Hungary, and the US. There have been reports, but also in African countries against Chinese and European people who have been blamed for spreading the virus. So my assessment is that there might be a long-term effect on the demand for labor migration, for example, in dialogue processes, because of governments now trying to get alternative workforce instead of the foreign workers who come to the agriculture sector or hospitality for seasonal work. Maybe if you have questions, I can get back to this later, what the trends are. How did governments try to replace seasonal workers with domestic workers or asylum seekers or other migrants already present? There might also be geopolitical effects in terms of dialogues, and more resources will be needed in cooperation because if the EU has less to offer in terms of seasonal work and circular migration opportunities, they need to have other resources, other offers to partner countries. Thank you very much for your patience, and now I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I would also like to thank all who raised their questions via chat and invite everybody who hasn't done so yet to do so. Feel free to ask questions. Also, thank goes to those who shared links to their publications. And thank you also for the reminder of the Eastern Partnership panel on migration, mobility and integrated border management, earlier known as the panel on migration and asylum, with which the Prague process coordinates and cooperates, and we share our work plans on for coordination purposes, not to overlap when it comes to dates or topics. Before we move to the, well, let's start the questions and answers session. Thank you again, Christoph. And my first question would be, we speak about the evolution of European Union's external migration policy. So how do you think, what is the role of intergovernmental dialogues on migration with the perspective of the evolution, and should they evolve at all, or should they rather remain traditional as they are, platforms for exchange between governments of their priorities and lessons learned? What do you think, Christoph?
Thank you, Radim, for that question. Regarding the future of the dialogue processes, I believe that the dialogues will be reinforced. They will be stronger and perhaps also based on more project-linked cooperation and dialogue. I mentioned already the finances being put into migration and asylum projects in cooperation with third countries. We don't only have a new commission and a new commissioner for home affairs and migration, we also have a new financial perspective for the long-term budget of the EU 2021 to 2027. This will actually allow a dramatic increase in funding of migration related activities, which could benefit the dialogue processes. So the Commission proposal is that the EU budget for managing migration and asylum will reach 11.3 billion euros, up from 7.3 billion for the previous period. So there is a dramatic increase. And also it's particularly mentioned in the budget that 4.2 billion of this funding will be targeting a flexible and fast response projects with a real European added value, such as resettlement or responding to urgent needs and channeling emergency funding to member states. And at the time, Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU president, said that the long-term EU budget is about acting where the EU adds the most value. I would like to say that the dialogue processes, they have shown that they add value to cooperation between EU and its partner countries. They have been building trust, bringing together different states and actors with often very different starting points, facilitating participants to identify shared interests and values. So in the future, more and more of the EU partner countries will turn from countries of net emigration to net immigration. They will need to share good practices with other countries who have more experience of migration management. I can refer to the International Organization for Migration, which is now a UN-related agency, is also facilitating regular meetings of a large number of regional consultative processes at the global level. Perhaps if we look at the Prague process, there might be opportunities for the ICMPD to facilitate meetings between the Prague process and other EU-related regional processes to share experiences and to learn from each other. And I also think that based on the mobility partnerships, which have been project-based, for example, Moldova and the EU had around 70, maybe up to 100 different projects. So all these projects generate lots of experience which could be evaluated, and then maybe some could be upscaled, repeated in a different region and benefit the dialogue processes.
Thank you very much for the answer. The future sounds bright and there will be work to be done for all of us. Now I hand over to Irina to facilitate our questions and answer session. Irina, please.
Thank you, Radim. Thank you, Krzysztof, for your presentation. So we got a few questions so far, so I'd like to invite our participants, our listeners, to raise more questions if they have them. And we start with the first one. There was first a clarification whether one of our listeners, Oleg, has understood you correctly that EU needs more migrants. And then the question would be the following. With regard to the categories of migrants, has there been done any needs assessment on the EU level?
Yes, the European Commission is working actively with legal migration opportunities. And if you see at the EU legislation, there is a division between various types of labor migrants. We have the blue card, which is under review for highly skilled migrants. There is a specific directive for seasonal workers. So there is a framework, and within that framework, there have been needs assessments. When the directives were prepared, there were needs assessments and various figures were mentioned. They are, of course, not up to date now. Currently, I haven't seen any specific needs assessment, but I heard Commissioner Ylva Johansson last Sunday mentioning, actually referring to this need, that because of the aging population, the EU will need more migrants. And usually the healthcare sector is being highlighted because we in many EU member states, we lack skilled healthcare workers, both doctors and nurses. So this is something, of course, which is being explored both by the EU Commission and by individual EU member states.
All right, thank you very much for your reply. So we got the next question. Do you think that the COVID-19 will bring less circle migrants and more permanent migrants? Do you think there will be a trend like that?
Yes, I think that there might be a slight decrease in the willingness of EU member states to continue with the structural system which is in place now, which basically says that the agricultural sector is very important, but the wages are low. So it's very difficult to attract natives to work in the agricultural sector. And also, as I mentioned, seasonal work and circular migration has been part of the EU offer to third countries in terms of cooperation and dialogue in the mobility partnerships. So what I wanted to mention in my speech was that I see a tendency that governments in Europe now realize that they can replace the seasonal foreign workers, for example, with asylum seekers who are already in the country and low-skilled migrants with a foreign background, that they might start incentive programs to attract those people so that EU member states will be less dependent on foreign seasonal workers. So this is what I see ahead of us. In terms of being replaced by more permanent immigration, I'm more skeptical, because I think that the general trend in Europe is to reduce overall immigration rates, including for the permanent settlement. But there is a very large division, a polarization. So at the top level, executives, IT, engineers, skilled people, maybe doctors, there will be more because these are categories that are needed. But in terms of the low skilled, there will continue to be less and less demand.
All right, thank you. We have a pretty similar question, but I still like to raise it, from Elena Sadowska. She asks about the bilateral agreements, whether there are any that would be signed or planned to be signed to attract more seasonal labor immigrants to the agriculture sector. But you pretty much answered that. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more here.
Yeah, no, I am not aware of any current negotiations or new agreements. I think the time frame has been too slow and attention has been elsewhere. But I think that most of the EU member states have agreements already in place for agricultural workers. Either they have very broad legislation that allows for seasonal workers, or they have specific schemes. For example, in Sweden, we just have a general legal framework and any kind of labor migrant can apply and try to enter the labor market. But in Italy and some other countries, Italy, Spain, they have a tradition of specific programs where they invite specific nationalities as circular migrants or seasonal migrants. But what I want to emphasize is that also Italy now in recent weeks proposed a decree to temporarily regularize 200,000 migrants for 1 year to respond to the shortage in the agriculture labor force. So there we also see the tendency using the migrants who are already present, irregular or asylum seekers, to put them to work rather than invite new people as seasonal workers.
Pretty understandable. I don't quite see any other questions, but I have one of my own. Do you think that the developments around the coronavirus crisis will affect somehow the formation of the future Migration Pact? Will it has any linkage, any influence on that regard?
Yes, this is difficult to say because it's a complex issue also linked to border controls in general and the workings of the Schengen. You know now that this year we are celebrating 35 years of Schengen. In 2015, after the refugee crisis, many EU member states re-entered border controls, Schengen controls. Similar things happen now to stop the spread of the coronavirus. So border controls have been reimposed. So that could be one effect on the new Migration Pact, that there will be more emphasis on emergency preparedness. There might be other crises in the future. There might be new refugee crises. For example, the link between climate change, environmental change, and migration might lead to very large-scale influxes in the future, and how to react to them. So I think the EU, with the pact, will be interested in preparatory work, so preparing for new crisis situations. And this is also part of the budget. So the budget has made available, due to the 2015 refugee crisis, a flexible amount of money. So there might be emergencies It's not enough to close borders around Schengen. You might also have to work closer at a high cost with third countries. So, for example, to closing down migration routes in Asia or Africa rather than next to Schengen. So this will, I think, affect the cooperation around the pact.
Thank you very much. Our participants are not so active today, so there are no questions. I'd like to invite maybe Radim to return back to the screen. Maybe you would like to add a few words.
Thank you very much. Well, indeed, I think the situation still remains somehow unpredictable when it comes to the pandemic, because when looking at the East, I have a map in front of me, the countries still remain let's say 2 months behind the European Union, where restrictions are being lifted in the moment in numerous countries, while looking at Russia or Central Asia or Ukraine, the regimes are, the quarantine or restrictions are still in place. Some countries started to reintroduce them, like Azerbaijan, if I'm not mistaken, after softening returned to tougher restrictions. So how to say in which direction not only the policy but the situation will develop. And I think we had a webinar on this issue with Professor Muntz, who outlined 4 scenarios of the future, how it might look like. We also listened to the presentation of other colleagues who were focusing on Ukrainian labor migrants in the EU. And there I think I asked a question. Now we speak about the EU policy and interests, of course, in labor force from non-EU countries, but we see that the non-EU countries also have interest in their own labor migrants or labor force that returned after the closure of the EU countries and the Schengen back home. And some of them show tendencies to motivate the labor force to stay home and work on the interests of their countries, which again is an issue to be balanced between remittances that contribute to the state budgets and the labor force that is needed in the countries, because many of those we are speaking about, other than Central Asians, show decline in demographies, while Central Asia is growing. So the question was, what will Ukraine do if their labor force, again, after the pandemic is over, how to say when, move elsewhere? Because Ukraine, and I use the country as an example, is in need of labor force. And they, I think, lack, if I'm not mistaken, 4 to 5 million in productive age. So this looks like there might be competition or restrictions on labor force from non-EU countries to move elsewhere, if that is possible at all. What do you think about this, Christoph? Will there be competition of labor force? You mentioned there will be more demand on high-skilled migrants, but low-skilled are also needed. So what do you think would be the best solution for both the EU and our non-EU neighborhood or other countries we deal with?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Radim. Actually, this relates to a certain extent to the previous question, whether there have been agreements of new seasonal workers coming to Europe because of the COVID-19. And actually, as far as I know, there is one example of Germany looking for 10,000 missing seasonal workers that they wanted to recruit. And also, I think there was a specific recruitment going on in Romania and Bulgaria to work in the health sector in some EU member states because of the COVID. So we can see that the effects are going both ways. So both in terms of trying to replace the traditional source countries of seasonal workers with other migrants who are already present in EU member states, but in the very short term to fill the gaps by new recruitments. And of course, some of the migrants who left the EU, they didn't leave because they lost their jobs, but they were fearing to be infected by COVID-19. For example, we see because of the climate that this virus is more active during the winter time when it's cold. It hasn't been as spread in African countries yet, and there is a time lag. So for example, COVID-19 came later to Latin America, and now it's the biggest source. US has been very hard hit, but the countries like Brazil and Chile are not hard hit. So there is a delay geographically, so to speak, so that the hard hit European countries are now opening up, while others might still keep borders shut and lockdowns for a longer time. And then many experts are expecting a new second wave, which might be even worse in the autumn. And this will, of course, affect future migration flows. But then in the autumn and winter, we don't have the agricultural season. So then we need to look at other migrant categories. And for example, from Ukraine, there have been many construction workers. This is also an issue that might affect EU internal mobility and mobility from Ukraine to the EU, from Ukraine to Poland, for example. That will the Polish employers try to use the workforce there is because of the COVID scare, or will they continue to prefer migrants coming from third countries? It's difficult to assess, I think, today. But in terms of this chain reaction that you mentioned, there is chain migration. So, for example, if Ukrainians go to Poland to work, they are replaced by other migrant workers further east from other Eastern European countries. If you look at Moldova, for example, there have been a tendency that men predominantly go to Ukraine and Russia as construction workers, while women go to Italy in the healthcare and domestic work. So you have these kind of patterns in Eastern European countries and further afield. So we are all interconnected through these labor migration chains. And as I said, I think people in Europe at least have realized that we are very heavily reliant on labor migration from other countries. Is this good from a structural perspective or not? So there will be a debate, maybe some policy changes to try to replace with domestic workers in the future.
Thank you. Lina?
Yeah, I see that we got another 3 questions. So the first one relates to the educational migration. Our listener Marina asks that many Ukrainians study abroad, but because of the COVID-19 and many of the e-learning opportunities, do you think that the number of students who will or possibly would apply for the education abroad will decrease?
Because of COVID? Because
of the COVID and also the e-learning process. A lot of universities developed their online courses, so there's been a huge development on the technological side.
Yeah, I think this is the big change we see across the world, that digitalization will be much faster. We have all suffered from the corona with the lockdowns, and we are now used to use Skype or Zoom, other technical equipment to work from home. This will probably affect the traveling and work abroad habits as well. Why send people to conferences at a high cost when you can have these nice web seminars? It's not as interactive, so there are some deficiencies, but I think many companies will rethink. For example, I can mention some Swedish companies such as Volvo, a big car maker, which is actually bought by a Chinese company. In the past, they used to send Swedish high-skilled workers to China, to Shanghai, Shenzhen, also to Hong Kong. Now, all that staff are Chinese. They don't send people because it's very expensive. So if you consider that also for students, if we have equipment at universities and the universities were closed down, Sweden was open, for example, low-level primary education, but the universities and tertiary education closed down. So also, of course, in the universities now they have the technical equipment and skills, and they are used to having online courses. So I can understand if this will lead to a less skilled migration, less educational migration. The other thing is that Delmi, the Swedish Migration Studies delegation, did a study actually on foreign students, which was part of a development cooperation project with Eastern European countries. We did an evaluation of the former students. Where did they go? How did they use their training in Sweden? And very interestingly, about a third of them continued as foreign students from Sweden to other European countries. So Sweden studies here was used as a stepping stone to study in other countries. So you have this secondary mobility, which might also be affected. If governments will be hesitant to have too many migrants around, of course, this will also affect the students.
Thank you very much. And we have another interrelated question about technology. And Jennifer asks, is there a role for technology to help more effectively match skills with labor shortages? Or is the challenge more to do with the legal frameworks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And technology is used to match demand and the available staff, the potential workers. For example, the EU has a platform where you advertise the vacancies, but this is not directly linked to immigration. Technology is more frequently used in Australia and New Zealand. So there, the immigration authorities, when you apply for immigration on actually the same web platform, companies are allowed to advertise. So even before you enter Australia and New Zealand, you can show your skills, you can put your CV online, and the potential employer will look for candidates, and there is the matchmaking already at the border or before the border. So I can see that technology can actually be used for interviews with the foreign applicants. I think that one of the reasons why Sweden, which has a very generous system for labor immigration, the OECD said that Sweden is the most generous in the world in terms of its labor migration regulation. It's totally demand driven. So if there is the demand among employees and no EU citizen or no Swedish citizen want a job, anyone in the world could apply. So for Sweden, I think this technology could be used because many Swedish employers, they hesitate to take the cost and risk. If you have an applicant for an IT business job, an applicant from Tunisia or Mexico, to take the risk and cost to fly that person into Sweden for an interview. Of course, why not use online interviews instead? So I think when the technology is there, more and more companies will use this technology to have interviews and recruitment, also to maybe talk to the reference persons for the applicant. So you basically reduce the risk and the transaction cost of an employment.
Thank you. And with regard to the legal frameworks, because we had a second question from the same listener, whether you talked right now about the technology, but do you think the challenge has more to do with the legal framework. Perhaps it's not on the side of the technologists to just simply match the skills in the right way, but it has to do with the legislation of a specific country or EU as a whole.
Yeah, the legal framework is important. For example, there has been a debate for many years whether it is a good idea to have work visas, which means that even an applicant for a work position could apply for a visit, a short-term visa, just to go to a country and to go to some interviews. This is not possible in many countries, but if the legal framework allows that, of course, it will be much more easy, for example, for a Russian or Ukrainian IT engineer to visit the company in Poland or France, to go to some interviews and to have a face-to-face contact, which is always much better. So I think as I mentioned before, also New Zealand and Australia allow this kind of matching at an early stage in their legislation, but for many EU member states, the legal framework is not there. But still, it's not forbidden. So it's not forbidden to apply for a job which is advertised, which no EU citizen wants to take. So in many cases, it's up to the individual and the contacts and networks. But the legal framework can be an additional help, assistance beyond the personal networks.
Thank you. And I have a question that kind of relates to your last part of your answer. With regard to the low-skilled jobs in Sweden, Fredrik mentions that in Sweden, every summer we need people for the berry industry, but they are usually a lot of Thai people come for this type of job. And do you think that in the future, there is a possibility to motivate Swedish citizens to take up this and to take up and work in these specific skilled occupations?
Thank you for that question, because Delmi published a study on this migrant corridor between Thailand and Sweden. Since many years back, it's mainly Thai berry pickers who every year come to the forests in northern Sweden to pick berries. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Thai people come every year. Many of them come back year after year. The problem is, of course, for the Thai berry pickers, that there is a certain competition from the EU internal market as well. Some Romanian and Bulgarian pickers compete, but they continue to come. But because of the COVID-19 and the news that Sweden didn't have a lockdown and we have relatively high mortality rates, actually the Thai government said that we are not allowing Thai workers this season to come to Sweden. So it was the source country that said no more seasonal migration because of the risk to get infections and then to return and spread the infection in Thailand. So that's interesting. And then the Swedish berry picker industry raised this issue, put some pressure on the government that there will be a serious problem if we don't get the workforce. So it's an issue. And as I mentioned, in other EU member states, the idea is that migrants who are unemployed in Sweden, why don't they go and pick berries? The problem is that the wages are so low. So Swedish natives won't do it. Maybe young people can do it, but they are not so experienced as the Thai people. So they cannot cover up for the Thai people who have been 15 years in a row picking and are very quick, very professional. If you put an 18-year-old young person there for very low wages, it's difficult to motivate. So what the government needs to do, I think, is to subsidize this kind of employment situations. And actually the Swedish government already extended some of its subsidies So it could basically pay one part of the wages to the employer. So the employer could offer a higher wage for the picker. So if you get the normal wage plus some additional money from the government, this could attract more Swedish natives and immigrants who are already in Sweden.
Thank you. Yeah, I quite agree with your opinion. I think without an additional support from the state side, it's quite difficult to motivate anyone to work and take up the low-skill job. We have another question from Oleg. He asks about the future, whether the future would rather look into the side of the organized labor migration schemes on the basis of the interstate or intergovernmental agreements. Do you think that that would be the future?
I didn't really get the question. So the question is, would international agreements?
Yeah, on the organized labor force migration schemes, the organized labor schemes, for instance, there is such an agreement between Russia and Uzbekistan, so that Uzbekistan supplies Russia with labor force according to the agreement that is set. So the skills, for instance, are chosen beforehand, and the people are supplied for the specific industry to support this industry in a specific framework, and the contracts are being settled before migrants arrive to Russia. So do you think that the future would be in this direction, would be going in this direction?
Yeah. Well, you know that the Global Compact for Migration, which was put in place in December 2018, this foresees this kind of cooperation, and the UN has made statements which are favorable to this kind of bilateral agreements. The ILO has a lot of experience of bilateral labor agreements and can advise governments. The Global Compact context advertises some kind of scheme where you involve training in advance in the country of origin, work in the country of destination, which is relevant for your home country, and then you return and bring new skills and you can work at home. So this is a version of the circular migration scheme that the EU was pushing for starting in 2007. But we also know that some of these schemes were only tested for a short period of time because it was difficult. The Netherlands had a project with medium-skilled workers from two source countries. It involved employers, so there was a lot of negotiation with employers to have both training and work. So it would be, you know, this win-win-win, win for the destination country, win for the source country, and win for the migrant, to have training and work according to the needs of these employers. But it was very heavy to organize, and actually very few migrants were prepared to join this program. Another example is between Moldova and Italy, that Moldova, like Romania, are now pushing for developing their wine industry. They want higher quality wine to be exported to the world market. So Moldova and Italy had a cooperation project where, similarly to the Netherlands, some Moldovan workers would go to Italy and learn the wine craft and then go back to develop the wine industry. I think that was more successful, but these agreements do not fit all countries. Some countries have a lot of experience of this, for example, Spain. I think they want to continue with that to some extent. At some stage, Spain had about 600,000 labor immigrants. Many of them came through this kind of bilateral agreements from Morocco and Tunisia. And also in Morocco, ANAPEC, the Moroccan employment agency, was involved in labor matching to have this kind of bilateral agreement. So I think It fits some countries, but it's also relevant to the legal framework. In the Swedish legal framework, it wouldn't fit because we don't favor any particular country. The same thing with the EU blue card. It doesn't favor specific original countries. It's open to any applicant from the world who fulfills the criteria. But for some countries, I think in Central Asia, for Russia, I think they have interesting experiences which can be shared with other countries as well in this regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that you pretty well answered the question. And then we have another two questions. One is rather of a general nature. Do you think that there will be more regular migration pathways after the COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the previous commission with Juncker, they tried to convince EU member states to offer more legal migration opportunities as part of the dialogue processes. But as far as I heard, not many volunteered. So there was a lack of concrete offers. I think also Italy, who used to have a quota for labor immigrants, they got rid of the quota. So they don't have a specific target. So in terms of more legal opportunities, this is part of the Migration Pact as well. So Ylva Johansson, the new commissioner, is working actively. How can the EU offer more legal opportunities? And partly the idea is not only that we need more migrants because of the aging population in EU, but also to replace the irregular migration with legal migration. So in that context, more legal pathways is promoted by the EU, but not only for labor migration, also for resettlement. So instead of having to see people dying in the Mediterranean, paying lots of money to smugglers and then failing as asylum seekers, the EU Commission is now increasingly trying to look at refugee resettlement in cooperation with UNHCR. So basically, the UNHCR would do the screening in the first country of asylum, and then there would be resettlement from that. But of course, this is a question whether it should be voluntarily arranged by all EU member states or if it should be some program managed by the EU. I think most EU member states would like it to be voluntary. And actually resettlement is very limited globally, and the US cut down on the resettlement, for example. So this is a very, very small part of the total, what is it, 60 million displaced people under the responsibility of UNHCR. A very small fraction of that is part of the resettlement program. But I think there won't be a very big change, but to some extent there is an active effort to increase legal labor migration and the resettlement.
Yeah, I think that that's been on the agenda for the last number of years, to replace irregular migration with regular migration more, and we are all in favor of that. And the last question is regards to the United Kingdom. Do you know what is the status of the United Kingdom after the Brexit in all types of migration dialogues that you mentioned during your presentation?
Yeah, I think Radim knows this more than I do, but I guess they are not there anymore. They don't participate.
I would like maybe to invite Radim if he wants to add also anything to this.
Thank you for the question also. Well, to what I know, UK and the EU are now continuing with the Brexit talks, and there is a transitional period that ends in December this year. So for now, I think UK participation, at least in the track process, is rather on hold. But we hope to welcome them back as of January next year. If I may share my personal opinion, the Prague process is an intergovernmental dialogue that is an informal and non-binding and voluntary participation based possibility or platform for exchange of views. So I would say it would be good to have UK back in the group and discuss with them also their priorities, interests, and look at their best practices. But it's my opinion. For now, I think UK participation in the Prague process is currently on hold.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Radim. That was the last question that we got, and I think that we're pretty much on time, perfect timing. So I'd like to turn back to Radim and maybe for his final words.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for your presentation. Thank you very much, Irina, for facilitating this session. Thank you very much, participants, for your active participation, for listening and for asking questions and sharing links to useful information. Before ending, I think we touched upon the new Migration and Asylum Pact of the European Union. We are currently in the Migration Observatory planning another webinar on this topic in the course of July. I am not in a position to share a concrete date right now, but we will dispatch invitation in due time. So we hope to have you back for that one. And before closing this webinar, I would like to ask you all to kindly take 1 or 2 minutes and fill in the evaluation form that will appear on the screen right now. So thank you very much. Goodbye and see you next time.